Hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about human development. I know that seems like a pretty broad term, and although we could spend classes, an entire major even, talking about human development, today we're going to cover some brief concepts within human development and a topic that is one of my research interests. So to begin, a quick introduction of human development. Although it seems like a pretty broad term and it covers quite a bit of the lifespan, a general definition includes the pattern of development in human capabilities that occurs throughout the course of life. So what does it involve? Well, if we briefly break it up into different domains, we have the physical development domain, which includes changes in someone's biological nature. So an example for this would be puberty. The body is undergoing several changes in physical development. Another example of what human development involves is cognitive development. This includes changes in someone's thoughts, intelligence, and language. So an example for this would be the acquisition of language, or even your thought development. So as you get older, your levels of thought change, so you're able to have abstract thoughts. And then the last domain involves social emotional development. This includes changes in someone's relationships with other people and emotions and personalities. So as you get older, your emotions develop and your relationships also develop. Okay, so a big question in human development is, do earlier or later experiences matter more? Well, some would argue that our early experiences play a larger role in our development. But on the other hand, others would argue that later experiences are more influential. The truth? Well, actually, we don't really know. Although a lot of research has been focused on early development, when we're looking at how different difficult experiences affect our development, one of the things that researchers look at is resilience. This is the concept that is defined by one's ability to recover or bounce back from hardships or adversity. So that brings me to my next topic. Although your book doesn't cover this concept, I think it's important that you guys learn about. So, within the resilience literature, there is a topic called ACES, which is known as Adverse Childhood Experiences. So what this is the concept that basically says childhood experiences, both positive and some negative, have a tremendous impact on our future. And this future includes things like violence victimization, perpetration, and lifelong health and opportunity. As such, early experiences are important for the public as a public health issue. Research in this area has been referred to as adverse childhood experiences, as I was once saying. The higher ACEs scores an individual has, the more likely they are to have behavioral, social, and health problems long-term that span across adulthood. So the ACE study is the original study that brought all of this information to light. So the ACE study originally suggested a direct link between childhood trauma and the onset of adult chronic mental health disease, violence, and being a victim of violence. Actually, almost half of the nation's children have experienced at least one or more type of serious childhood trauma. This translates into a giant number that I will completely butcher if I try to say, but this means many children in our nation are being affected from ACEs. So what does ACEs actually look like? Well, ACEs breaks up their items into 3 different domains. So there's abuse, and that's broken down into physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. There's neglect. Neglect is broken down into physical and emotional neglect. Then there's household dysfunction, which is a broader category, but includes events like mental illness within the household, mother that was treated violently, divorce, substance abuse, and incarcerated relative. So what ACES does is they took the top 10 items that most people were endorsing, and then they put them together. So these domains that you're looking at are the most common. Here is the ACE pyramid. This is a conceptual framework in which ACE was developed upon. So if you look at it from bottom to top, you'll see that as one develops, you can see the path that it would take. So an adverse childhood experience occurs. This then influences neurodevelopment, which then influences social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. This leads to the adoption of health risk behaviors, which then leads to disease, which ultimately leads to an earlier death. So, these outcomes that I'm talking about, what do they look like? Well, this is a very, very short list of some of the outcomes associated with ACEs. So, for example, there's several physical health outcomes associated. Headaches, autoimmune diseases, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, sexually transmitted infections, sleep disturbances, pregnancy outcomes. Social emotional outcomes, well, lower cognitive ability, lower school performance, insecure attachment, risky sexual behavior. There's also several mental health issues associated with higher ACEs scores. Depression, anxiety, externalizing problems, substance use, suicide attempts. Now, looking at these outcomes, just because you have a high ACEs score, this doesn't mean that you will automatically have all of these outcomes. What the research suggests is that the higher ACEs score that you have, the greater likelihood or risk of these occurring you're at. So this is just a visual of the behaviors and a couple more that I didn't mention before, but smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missed work, physical and mental health include obesity, suicide attempts, broken bones, stroke. Some of these may seem surprising, but if you sit down and really think of the associations between higher adverse childhood experiences and these outcomes, they do tend to make sense. Broken bones is one that really surprises a lot of people. How can a childhood trauma affect my likelihood of having a broken bone later on? Well, as we discussed before, higher ACEs scores are associated with risky behavior. If you're engaging in risky behavior, or even lower cognition, you might be more likely and susceptible to broken bones. There's actually a measure that you can use to find your ACEs score. So, a score of 4 or higher would suggest that you are at risk for these outcomes. Greater risk, I should say. You can find out what your ACEs score is by taking the ACE short form, which is a shorter form of the measure that's about 10 items, and you can figure out what your score is and see if you're at a greater risk for any of these outcomes. So one thing that we won't talk about today, but it's important to mention and we can cover at the next chapter, is the idea of resilience that I once mentioned early on in the chapter. So once again, resilience is the ability for one to bounce back from hardship. So although we just covered a plethora of adverse childhood experiences, it's important to remember that there is hope and that isn't the end. So this idea of resilience is, what is it about certain people who have had all of this childhood trauma but can still bounce back and lead successful lives? Well, there's a concept called protective factors. These are factors that may buffer all these stressful events. So it's important to remember that higher ACEs scores don't automatically lead to all of these outcomes. You may be experiencing protective factors that are buffering the negative effects of those outcomes. Now, as I mentioned, your book doesn't cover ACEs, but I think it's really important research to be aware of when you're considering how early childhood experiences can influence human development across the lifespan. So, as you move forward learning about human development and the different concepts that are covered within this chapter, keep in mind that early experiences do play a role in later development.